What's up everyone? Welcome to another Joel Arsenault YouTube video. In my last one, I showed you guys rebuilding my very first crankshaft and I talked about having to make some custom tools. In this video, I'm going to talk to you guys about how I made those tools, how they're meant to be used, and explain why when I go to rebuild my next crankshafts, I'm going to have to make some more tools. Let's go take a look at the bench and I'll show you guys some of the stuff that I made. First off, I'll talk a little bit about my hydraulic press because if you're going to be rebuilding crankshafts, you're definitely going to need one of these. This is a 40-ton hydraulic press, which is a little bit overkill, but that actually works out to be quite advantageous. I bought this from Princess Auto, which is basically Canada's version of Harbor Freight. It is an air-over hydraulic press, which means I can hook my air compressor up to it, or I can pump a handle to activate the cylinder or the ram. One of the main reasons why using an overkill hydraulic press is so much nicer than using one that meets the minimum requirements is because hydraulic presses tend to store a lot of kinetic energy. The way a hydraulic press works, I'm sure all of you know, you've got your hydraulic ram that pushes down on the part is supported by the table, and the table is connected in some way to the ram by some sort of a frame. Well, that frame is going to flex as the ram pushes down on the part. This is trying to be stretched apart. So these arms here are trying to be pulled apart. The table is trying to bend down this way, and the part that supports the ram is actually trying to bend up this way. Let's say a 40-ton press would structurally fail around 80 tons, and a 10-ton press would structurally fail around 20 tons. But what that means is that a 10-ton press pushing at 10 tons is going to stretch this material and bend the bed a whole lot more than a 40-ton press pushing at 10 tons. So why does any of this matter? Well, imagine you're trying to push a pin into a hole that takes 10 tons and you have a 10-ton press. What's going to happen, you're going to get 7, 8, 9 tons, 9.5 tons, and then all of a sudden it's going to meet that, it's going to get to that 10-ton threshold, and by that time everything in the press is going to have flexed, and all of that flex, when the pin finally moves, is going to get translated into movement of the pin. So instead of being able to move the pin 5/1000ths of an inch at a time, you're going to build up, build up, build up, and then it's going to jump maybe 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 of an inch. It all depends on the actual piece, the friction surfaces and whatnot. So that's my spiel on why a overkill press is so much nicer to use. When you're pushing something that takes 6 tons, it basically can be controlled within a few thousandths of an inch when you're pushing it together, instead of having to set up a whole lot of safety margins for yourself. Next up, we have the custom bearing pullers that I made. Believe it or not, this was one of the things that frustrated me the most about the crank rebuild, was actually pulling bearings off of the crankshaft. I know there are numerous different ways to do this. You can actually cut them apart with a grinder, you can weld stuff to them and then pull off in that way. I wanted to do something that was a little bit more civilized. Mind you, this still does destroy the bearings. Some bearings have removable, bearing keepers, but most of them are actually going to be riveted in place, and if you're taking your crankshaft bearings off, you should probably just replace them anyway. A little bit about what these are and how I made them. Started life as bolts, and you can see in this one it still has the hex in the end of it. And so what I did is I actually turned the head of the bolt down. You could do this with a drill and a grinder if you wanted to, but I measured the diameter of the ball inside of the bearings that I wanted to pull, and I turned down the outside to that diameter. Then what I did is I milled off the sides so that it would actually fit in through the slot. And then once it's inside there, you can actually turn it 90 degrees and it locks itself into the groove. So the downside, or a downside to making these, is that you have to make a different one for, well, most different sized bearings. Any bearing that has bigger or smaller balls, you're going to have to make different tools. How these work, for those of you who didn't see my other video, you have a normal puller like this. You drop these in like so. Put the custom parts into the bearing, turn them 90 degrees. Put that one in, turn it 90 degrees. Then you guys might have noticed in the other video that I actually used a zip tie to put around here. I did that for two reasons. One is that it makes the puller fit a little bit more snug inside of the bearing, which helped, and it allowed me to actually move the puller and the crank around without worrying about this stuff falling apart. There are plenty other ways to pull bearings off, but I am quite pleased with the way these worked, and there is very little or no chance of damaging the thing that you're actually pulling the bearing off of, so I will probably be making more of these as the need arises. I made these in my lathe, which made it quite easy, but if you only had a drill and an angle grinder, or a drill and a bench grinder, you could probably do the same thing. This bad boy here is a 15-inch long piece of Schedule 80 pipe that has an inside diameter of almost 6 inches. I currently have the piece of pipe secured to my table using two of these hold downs. I'm going to try to mill a slot out of it about 1.5 inches wide, so that means I'm actually going to have to make 2 passes and cut the piece out. Slotting this pipe could definitely be done with an angle grinder and a cutoff disc, and I suspect that it would be much quicker than this. This footage is sped up 40 times, and if you guys could hear the sound that it makes, you definitely wouldn't want to sit through half an hour of this. Well, that was a little bit more brutal than I expected it to be. There was a lot of vibration. I probably should have expected it. I'm using a roughing mill and I'm only holding the pipe in a couple of places. Also, it sprung open quite a bit, so this is more like a 1/2 inch gap, and I'm only using a 5/16 tool. So it actually popped open quite a bit, which is good because that means I actually got a bigger pipe than I paid for. I thought about this as I was cutting. I was about halfway through. I think this is actually welded pipe. I should have cut the welded section out, but for what I'm doing, I don't think it's going to matter at all. But now I've got to cut another piece out because I only want a 1.5 inch wide piece removed. I marked the 1.5 inches, and I actually need to cut it a 1/4 inch smaller because of how much it opened up. So the pipe actually opened up about a 1/4 inch just from the stresses that were on it. I don't know what this thing is called or if it even has a name, but basically what it is a piece of pipe or tube with a slot cut into the side of it. The main thing that you want to take into consideration when you're buying something like this is how much force you're going to be putting on it, and buy something that is definitely overkill. If you're working on something today that only takes 5 tons to push apart, next week you might be working on something that takes 20 tons. And the last thing that you want is this collapsing while you have 15 tons of pressure on it. So this is 10 millimeter thick or 3/8 wall. It will take plenty of pressure, so that's definitely not an issue for me. The next thing that you want to make sure of is that you get a big enough inside diameter so that it's just a little bit bigger than the crank web. If you're working on a bunch of different cranks, then make sure that you get one with a big enough inside diameter so that it fits your biggest crank. The reason for the slot being cut out in it here is so that your connecting rods have somewhere to go. So drop that in there like that. And once that's in there, put this thing on, and we'll talk a little bit about this other tool in just a second. But basically, this is how this works. Some of you may now be wondering why you can't just use this thing supported on the bed of your press to push your crank apart, and I'll show you a quick clip to explain why not now. As you can see, this thing basically bent like a wet noodle when it was just supported at the ends. There is a whole lot of leverage in the center, and that is a lot of force. This thing did not stand up at all. So when you're supporting it on a pipe, you're not supporting it way out at the ends. You're supporting it as close to the center as you can, which makes this thing a whole lot stronger. What I have here is a piece of plate steel that is 1/2 inch thick, and I am going to make another one of these, but as you guys can see, this is quite a bit more substantial. All right, I got the tube slotted out, and so now I'm moving on to the plate. I've decided to come in 2.5 inches approximately. I'm going to use this annular cutter, which means I had to slow down the speed of the mill dramatically. I don't know if it can be seen on camera, but I've got a couple of blocks of aluminum underneath the plate just to space it up so that I don't cut into my milling table. All right, I've got that centered there. And now what I'm going to do is put this cutter in, put the annular cutter in. And I think this is going to be I think this is going to take quite a while, because that's 3/4 inch plate steel. I might need to grab my hearing protection here. We'll see what happens. If I can push my crankshaft apart using this tool on this pipe, why did I go through the trouble of making this? Although I could have used this part, using something that was a lot more hefty, not only made it so that there was a lot less spring back, but this actually fits my crankshaft much better. So the distance between the webs on the ZXi 900 crank, this crankshaft here, the distance between the webs here just barely fits this 3/8 inch plate. In fact, it kind of doesn't. It's quite tight. Here is the crash crankshaft that I rebuilt in my last video. And here is this 3/4 inch plate. And it fits perfectly in between those crank webs. So the combination of this plate not flexing and also it being a nice flat even surface that fits very well makes this a lot more pleasant to work on, and it also made me feel a lot more comfortable putting, 10 tons of force on it. If you're going to be rebuilding a crankshaft, you definitely do not want to be using a steel hammer to do the truing. You can damage the webs, you could damage a bearing if you miss and hit that, which is very easy to do. You can also miss and hit the threads depending on how bad your aim is or how tired you get. And so you want a soft enough hammer that you're not going to be damaging what you hit. I did some pricing on brass and copper hammers and found that 2-pound copper and brass hammers were priced between $74 and $100. So what I decided to do is actually make my own hammer. I'll show you guys a little bit of footage of how I did that. I'm going to use these parallels to hold the mold up off of the surface of the vise. That's going to allow it to seal better on the aluminum. The reason why I'm using aluminum is because it's going to absorb a lot of heat. That way the lead will harden up even if it starts to leak a little bit, and then it will basically seal itself. I already had this lead as I had been collecting it for a few years, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for safety reasons. Lead is toxic and it is dangerous to handle any molten metal. I now have a lead hammer and a mold, so I can make another one or remake this one when it finally gets damaged enough. It is quite soft. You can see this is how much damage it got from truing one crankshaft, so it will definitely have to be remolded or recast at some point. I didn't mention this in the video, so I'll mention it now. I did end up drilling some holes in the end of the handle before I put the handle in the mold, just so that the head wouldn't come flying off while I was swinging it. If it loosens up at all, I will make sure to recast it and not take any chances, because you don't want that going flying across the room. It turned out to weigh 3 pounds, 2 pounds, 15.5 ounces. I didn't plan that in any way, but it is pretty much a perfect weight for what I'm doing, so I'm really happy with it. I mentioned earlier in this video that I was going to have to make some custom tools for the next crankshafts that I rebuild, and this is one of those crankshafts. This is out of a Kawasaki 900 triple, and this is the truing stand that I made for the Crash. As you can see, it fits on the two center bearings, and it has a cutout for the seals. This does not fit in between the webs on the triple crank, and also I will need to span the width of the webs so that I can support it here and here when I'm truing the ends. So I'll have to make another one of these, or maybe two more of these, for actually truing the triple cranks. And well, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to use this after bending it as many times as I have, so I might have to make another one of these. Despite all of these special tools that we talked about in this video, the biggest part of rebuilding a crankshaft is being creative and using your brain to figure out problems that you didn't know existed before you started. Guarantee you're going to run into some problems along the way, and you just have to think through them in a safe and effective manner. The special tools that you're going to find yourself looking for are going to be like little shim stock of metal so that you can prop something up so that it actually pushes straight. Different pins, sockets work really good in a lot of cases. And yeah, just coming up with tools that you didn't actually know were tools, or didn't know were press tools anyway. When I started thinking about rebuilding my first crankshaft, I was quite nervous. Despite being a mechanic for over 28 years, I've never rebuilt a crankshaft on my own, and I had a lot of questions. I started doing a lot of searching on the internet for specific tools and specific answers to questions that I didn't even know how to ask. And what I can say after rebuilding this crankshaft is you basically just have to jump into it and trust that you're not going to completely screw things up. There are so many different crankshafts out there, and even if somebody does have the specific one that you have, I guarantee you're going to run into problems that they didn't have, and they're going to run into problems that you didn't have. So you just got to jump into it. If your crank is already bad and needs a rebuild, chances are you can't mess it up so bad that even if you quit, somebody else can't rebuild it for you. That's what I have to say about that. I am not an experienced crank builder, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. If you guys want to support me on Patreon, there is a link in the description below if you want to see extras, outtakes, and random nonsense. There is also a link to my second channel, which is called Lowered Expectations. That's going to do it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Some of you may have seen this sitting around and wondered what the heck it was. This is an old jet pump off of my X2, and in some haste I decided that I was going to quickly try to build something to push my crank apart. And then when I had it finished, I decided that it was a stupid idea. Not only because it wouldn't have been long enough, but also because it was fairly thin wall. It wasn't very strong. I would have had to support this on the edges, and yeah, this was just a bad idea. So before I ever used this or attempted to use it, I just bit the bullet and went and bought some proper material.